Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Horn, and I'm a graduate assistant at the University of Texas at Austin in the Division of Equity and Community Advocacy. And I'm excited to welcome you all to our conversation from the Front Porch entitled East Austin Living Histories, the Legacy of the John S. and Drucie R. Chase Building and Beyond. These conversations started around 2018 as a community town hall that we called Front Porch Gatherings. But we wanted to hold a more intimate space for university faculty, staff, and students to be in conversation in relation with Austin community members, advocates, and activists. Specifically, we use storytelling in these conversations as an entry point into much broader discussions about anything from housing advocacy, from educational equity, or from economic equity, for example. Today's event will specifically be co-sponsored by the Black Diaspora Archive, which was founded at the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection in 2015 at the University of Texas. They collect everything from documentaries, audiovisual, digital, and artistic works related to the Black diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean. This includes everything from historical publications, contemporary records, personal papers, and rare material produced by and or about people of African descent. This event is also co-sponsored by the University of Texas Center for Community Engagement, Division of Community-Based Learning, which is a faculty-facing division that builds partnerships between faculty, students, and community organizations. They specifically serve as a resource to integrate service learning into university coursework. And lastly, our conversation today will be moderated by Stephanie Lang, who is the director of the Division of Equity and Community Advocacy at the University of Texas at Austin. Stephanie, prior to joining us at the Center for Community Engagement, worked at the John L. Warfield Center for 14 years. And she's also involved with community organizing around Austin, specifically related to cultural and historical preservation. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Stephanie to get us started in our discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for the introduction and just really kind of setting the framework around our conversation for today. And before we get into that conversation, I just wanted to thank several folks who really brought this into fruition. And the first one is Jeremy Horn for being the collaborator and somebody I could just bounce ideas off of, and all the work that you've done. I really appreciate it. To other ECA team member who is waiting in the wings, Ashlyn Gray, for all of her work on getting this event going, and her preservation work, some of which we're going to be talking about today. And as well, also behind the scenes, making everything happen, Jason Malin, who's the executive director for communications for DDCE. Would like to thank you and all my colleagues who are part of the Center for Community Engagement. So, without further ado, I want to bring in our guests to begin this conversation. But what I would really like to just say before I do that is how much of an honor it is for me to be in conversation with them today. These are folks who are friends and colleagues and, mentors in many ways. Inspirators, as my granddaddy used to say, folks that inspire and encourage me, who all approach this work through different vantage points and experiences and disciplines, all with this same goal of honoring and holding the stories and the histories and experiences of Black people throughout the diaspora, Black people in this country, Black people in Texas, Black people in Austin, and in historical communities. So without further ado, let's bring everybody out. All right. So our first guest I would like to introduce is Rachel Winston. Rachel is the inaugural Black Diaspora Archivist at the University of Texas at Austin. In this role, she is leading the university's efforts to build a library, special collections documenting the Black experience across the Americas and the Caribbean. Her work promotes research and study of the Black diaspora through primary source material, curated exhibitions, and archival activism. Rachel is alumna of Davidson College, the Choral Fellows Program in Public Affairs, and the University of Texas at Austin. All right, welcome.
Thank you.
And next we have Dr. Tara Dudley. Tara Dudley is the author of Building Antebellum New Orleans, Free People of Color and Their Influence, University of Texas Press 2021, and of a forthcoming biography on John Saunders Chase, 1925 to 2012. Her research examines the contributions of African American builders and architects to the American built environment, focusing on the antebellum and Reconstruction eras in Austin and Texas. She is the author of Building Antebellum New Orleans, as I said, and yes, we are. The other thing I'll add is she is a lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture, where she looks forward to connecting the next phase of her career starting in January 2022. All right. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And next we have Harrison Ephrait. Mr. Ephrait is a professional tour guide who is based out of Austin, Texas, and a native Texan. We need to add that to your bio.
Native East Austinite.
East Austinite, yes. He has been providing high quality sightseeing tours for over 16 years and has won the ACVP Employee of the Year in 2008. Harrison is very passionate about history and African American culture, heritage, and architecture. All right, and last but certainly not least, our final guest is Pamela Benson Owens. Okay. Hello. Pamela Benson Owens is the president and CEO of Edge of Your Seat Consulting Incorporated and is also in her third year of serving as the CEO of Six Square. For 25 plus years, Pam has owned Edge of Your Seat Consulting, a unique consulting firm that is dedicated to assisting for-profit, nonprofit, and faith-based entities. The major focus of Edge of Your Seat Consulting is to provide methodologies that help manage perceptions and narratives about complex and challenging issues with courage and strategic passion. So, and we will have more of these extended bios on our website so you can learn more about everybody. And so heavy hitters we have here. So I'm, again, over the moon, ready to get this started. So welcome. And to kind of start off, I would love for everybody to kind of share a little bit about who you are and the work you do, like how you kind of come into this work around, history and preservation, the discipline, the way in which you approach it. And I think that's probably enough for there. And then we'll go from there. Sound good? Okay. So who would like to start us off?
I'm happy to jump in. So as you mentioned in that very generous bio, Stephanie, I am an archivist and curator. So really what that boils down to is that when it comes to history and storytelling and narrative sharing, building, interpretation, I deal so often with the tangible things, with the things that have been left for us to create these stories and piece together these narratives from. So it's a very exciting, privileged space to work in, to see photos, to see handwritten letters, to see people's personal affects, their artistic works, their notebooks, things scribbled in the margins. And with that too, also honoring the fact that so often folks don't want to be remembered. Some do and want to leave their personal affects, family members collect, And for some people, that's not a part of how they want to move in the world. And accepting that truth and still being mindful and careful about the stories we tell and the language we use in telling those stories. So I'm excited to be here and be in conversation with people I admire so deeply in the community.
Thank you, Rachel. I will move it over to Tara.
Sure. I am an architectural historian by trade, and I come at this field of the profession from various lenses or perspectives. I'm not a native Austinite or Texan. I'm from Louisiana, and graduate school in the preservation program at UT Austin is what brought me here. And over the course of the years, I've worked as a historic preservation consultant at a local preservation firm here in Austin, and then in conjunction with that, had been teaching as a teaching assistant and then lecturer in the School of Architecture at the University of Texas. And over the past 2-3 years or so, have delved more deeply into academia as a full-time lecturer. And starting in January, I will be an assistant professor in the School of Architecture. And so just being able to, thank you guys, continue to pursue the work that I do as an architectural historian, but really working more largely in the built environment, and increasingly the stories of the individuals who have contributed to the built environment are as important to me, and sometimes more important than the actual buildings themselves, the physical fabric of those buildings, who created these spaces, how and why they inhabited them. And of course, looking at Black history in Austin and Texas and Louisiana have been my areas of focus. More increasingly, I also study interior design history in other areas as well. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Let's see. Harrison?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Well, let's see. I am manager of visitor services and tour ambassador at Visit Austin, and I am a certified tour guide through the Austin Tour Guide Association and have been giving tours for 16 years. And I'm also involved with Six Square, Austin's Black Cultural District. That has been a great joy of mine. And I am tour guide on call for the Driscoll Hotel. In fact, a book was published about the Driscoll Hotel a few years ago entitled The Grand Dame of Austin, and I wrote the introduction to that book. So I'm very happy with that, and I'm just happy with the fact that for me, this has been a way of coming home. I am a native Austinite, a native East Austinite, and it's so great that I've seen so much in my life, and the eyes are like cameras recording so much, and things that are still with us and things that are no longer with us. And this has been a great time for me to approach history, and I have approached it for the last 16 years as the art of recovery, the act of recovery, uh, for myself as well as for the community, either whether for those who know the history and those who do not know the history. And so many people do not know the history of Austin, or that and that Austin history is very vital, but also the history of African Americans in Austin, extremely vital in the development of Austin. So when you talk about Austin history, you cannot exclude the Black Austin history, or the Black contribution, Black Austinites, I'm sorry, to Austin's history.
Mhm. Thank you. And Pam?
I am Benson Owens, longtime Austinite and entrepreneur. And as mentioned, I own a consulting firm, but I also am the CEO of Six Square, which is the name of the organization that governs over the district, which is the 6 square miles, as predicated by the master plan of 1928. And so while we do focus a lot about cultural arts, what people probably don't know is that we do that as a catalyst to preservation, um, cultivating cross-cultural projects, economic development, education. And so we do a lot of those things. And people say, well, what is it really? We're all about removing obstacles for our people and figuring out how we honor the past, how we sit firmly in the present that feels like we're having to anchor ourselves for the community here that believes that history started when they woke up. And then for the future, figuring out how to support and fund the future. And so that's really what we're focused on. Small team of 5, but we're mighty. And we work really hard to remove obstacles so that Black excellence can be Black excellence.
All right, thank you. So, in thinking about what you all just shared, and, a big part of what this conversation is about, is starting with the Robertson Hill neighborhood and the John and Drucie Chase building. And so I know I have, worked with each of you in some way kind of around this history as, the Center for Community Engagement. And for those who are viewing this, may or may not know that it's going to be where we're housed. And so I would really like to talk about, for each of you, why, what is the importance? Do you see this importance, which I know the answer to, in the Robertson Hill community, the importance of this building and all the lives that it's lived, and even kind of how you specifically engage in that work. So, for example, with Harrison, with your tours, as an archivist, Rachel, the work that you do, Tara, with the history of John Chase. So if we could begin a conversation there, that would be great. Anyone who feels so moved.
For me, I think it just the story of the building and John Chase is a little bit indicative or representative of my experience with Austin is home for me now, and I technically live in Kyle, but in having been brought to Austin, and this is the place where I started my married life. I'm raising my children here, and John Chase was also not a native Austinite, but for a few short years made Austin home, really impacted the community by his various historic firsts that he achieved here, and was able to, Austin became the springboard for his career. He married a native Austinite, Miss Drucie Chase, or Drucie Rucker Chase, and just the way that East Austin was and is home for so many people, and the way that history has been remembered, but also how it's changing, and how we as professionals, tour guides, historians, archivists, community activists are recapturing that history, how we choose to re-embrace it and then share it, because as we know, every day, East Austin is changing more and more, so that it is, physically unrecognizable in many ways. But at the core of that, at the heart, are the people who established not only East Austin, but the Black people who established Austin, in their stories, and how those have perpetuated over the years and across the generations. And I think the Chase building can be representative of that in many ways, and speak to our responsibility to preserving those stories, to the university's responsibility for preserving those stories as well. So I think those are a few of the things that, based on my personal and professional experiences, that the Chase building means for me, and its important, place of prominence in East Austin in the Robertson Hill district.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I think is so important and exciting about the work that has been done to restore and preserve the John Chase House is that in so doing, it not only reminds us that the built environment is part of our living archive that we live and breathe every day, but also reminds us that in that space, there are so many connections, right? So as the story of the physical building is told, which within itself is just very marvelous, you uncover all of the different people who were involved in creating and building and uplifting those different iterations of life within that building and all of the different connections and touch points there. And so that is a really nice invitation for us to, for those of us who may not feel as though we are already in community with the building, with the East Austin community with Robertson Hill, it provides a nice way to begin that work of building community even after these stories that we're telling have been at their peak. So I think the work of working with you, Stephanie, and preserving the physical materials that have come out of the many lives of this house are a great way to start engaging students and community members in different ways and building on that connection as we also build community.
Definitely.
I like to think about what the community was like at the time that the Robertson, at the time that that particular building was constructed in the Robertson Hill area. The fact that that was even, I mean, it in the what was called the Negro District, but that was a vital part of East Austin, Black Austin. I mean, that's just a few blocks from what was called Black Downtown, between East 11th and East 12th Streets. Black Downtown with the clubs such as the Victory Grill and the also the Southern Dinette, the hotel that was up the street that Mr. Chase built or was a part of the construction of. The fact that on East 12th Street we had the Harlem Theater on East 12th Street. East 12th Street was heavily residential as well. And just a stone's throw from in 1952, well, that was the year that Samuel Houston merged with Tillotson.
Right.
Two separate schools within a stone's throw of each other and this particular place. And they merged, and these two schools relocated to the campus of Tillotson. So a lot of things were going on, and this house, I mean, this building was in the midst of it, and the design, the fact that it started out as the Colored Teachers Association building, that harkens back, of course, that brings up racial segregation, but the fact too that in this community, as well as throughout Texas in Black communities, people were organizing. There were associations. There were fraternal associations, professional associations, like the Colored Teachers Association, and just the impact that had on East Austin itself, and it spread to the rest of Texas as well as the rest of the nation. And this was at a time, of course, racial segregation, and the fact that over half of the streets in East Austin were not paved, and yet you had these things in buildings. You had progress. People were still going forward. They didn't let inconveniences like unpaved streets or lack of good lighting. They didn't let that hinder them. They truly made a way out of no way.
Absolutely. And in some cases, it was the 70s before some of the roads were paved. Right?
Over, I would say half of the streets in Black East Austin weren't paved until the 70s. And in Mexican East Austin, unfortunately, it was even worse. that's a shame.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
I really don't have much to add because these amazing colleagues have done it. And every time I hear Harrison, I learn something new every single time.
Yes.
Aware of the work, Stephanie, you've done, and Rachel and Karen. I would just say that as we're talking about this, as if you're, in this space and you're like, I don't know about the Trace building. I'm really, I've been really in a space, especially the last 2 years, that I just watched how far we're getting away from the narrative of Black Austin, and how we really have to anchor ourselves. That one of these kind of core tenets around culture is that we spark curiosity. So if you have been to that area and you see names that you are not familiar, right? Or I really encourage people to think about what it is you don't know when you're in East Austin, and then get curious enough to find out, right? So that we don't keep perpetuating this space where it's not important to know. It's the story, the narrative is important to know. You can't really, move things forward if you don't know, the past. So everything my colleagues said, and, how do we then sit in these spaces and create a culture around curiosity? And things are going so fast, and the pace is so busy in Austin, and we have to be more intentional about knowing and how that informs how we will move forward in the city, and where we honor a lot of times growth and development, and think we have to then eliminate history and the preservation. So that's all I have to add there, because my colleagues nailed it on and setting the background.
Yeah, no, this is all so true. And what comes to mind for me is something that you all have touched on. And there is this, we already know that there's this way in which the stories and the histories of, historically marginalized communities, in this case, Black communities, aren't part of this like formal archive in as many ways. And like what you mentioned, Rachel, the way we archive and all these ways that we hold into the history is not always seen, in the same light. And so how do you all kind of approach this with your work? First, this challenge around, many times this stuff hasn't been collected. This history is so unknown by so many, and so important, right? Many people have just recently learned about the 28 plan, the 1928 plan, and how that has impacted so much. So how do you, deal with that, kind of coming up against that challenge? And then, my second part to this is, especially right now, when there's such an urgency, because we know, the way displacement and gentrification is happening, we're even more at risk of erasing, the history that we are aware of. So how do you approach it? What can you kind of jewels or can you give to those of us who are also grappling with this work?
Well, how much time do we have?
I know, right? It's an easy question, isn't it?
I mean, what I would say is, I'll just kick off by saying, I think there's an opportunity to own that gentrification does some stuff that's horrible. We talk around it in the city. We soft pedal it in the city. We try to make it palatable. But gentrification does a lot of stuff that's not great, right? Displacement, right? We could list those things. I think we don't talk about those things directly. We try to soft pedal that. And I don't think it's serving us well. I think it cultivates an either or environment in way, an either or kind of narrative that's a problem. And we don't say these are the things about it that erode our culture and erode our history. And I really feel like if we don't have some direct conversations around how this impacts the financially vulnerable, how it creates disorientation around anchoring who we are and our identity, like all those things, You know, nobody's ready to talk about embodying inclusion while you're excluded. So I think there's some opportunities to practice some courage around the real conversations and to put emphasis on healing from the way in which we have misrepresented what's happening, and then rebuild. But I feel like at this point, there's always a halfway approach to that. We clean out a little bit of the wound, the bacteria in the wound, but not all of it. And I don't think it needs to be a full on clean out, meaning a real, thoughtful, honest conversation before we can really talk about how to co-create something that is accessible. And, you know, when we talk about affordable housing, there's affordable housing and then there's real affordable housing, right? I want to talk about the stuff that like you can actually live on, not this pseudo idea. So I'm in the thick of that all the time. And we have a deep tissue conversation to convene around what really happens and what really occurs in this community.
Mhm. Yes, yes, indeed. Rachel.
I never pass up an opportunity to preach the good word of preserving what you have. So often, too often, I meet Black and Brown folks in the community here in Austin or elsewhere who just don't think of what they have as significant when you think about larger history, right? But we are all living in this moment, contributing to history as it will be eventually. So if you have family photos, family papers, if they are in the garage, get them out. If they are on the floor, move them up. We all know it floods. In the attic, bring them down. You want things to be, for preservation reasons, at a more stable temperature, away from humidity and very damp places, and places that are vulnerable to pests as well. So think about that. Think about really treasuring. Maybe you got a box from a grandparent when you were cleaning out a house and you threw it in the garage. Bring that inside and really start to think about what you want to do with it. We are in a really wonderful moment here in Austin right now where there is a vibrant community of Black and Brown memory workers, of archivists, of people who can help, people who can talk with you about it. If you have materials that you yourself don't want to keep, people like myself who are happy to walk you through where that might live well in the city for other folks to access and engage with as they do this kind of narrative building and cultural recovery work that we've been talking about. So I just want everybody to walk away always knowing that your history, your legacy is important and worthy of being preserved. And it's important for us to first take ownership of doing that preservation work, because as history has taught us, outside entities might not treat and love our stories the way that we do.
Mhm. That's so important. And just to kind of encourage people that your voice and, you know, your stories and that our archives look different, right? You know, the funeral programs and the, you know, the family Bible and, you know, the land and the geography, like all these things are telling stories. So, and I'm having to reshape my mind around that. Like nobody wants my papers, you know. No.
You're mistaken.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to remind people that they too are founding fathers, founding mothers, brothers, sisters, what have you. That this country is still being founded, this city is still being founded, that we all possess history. We should think of ourselves as historians and look around, observe it. Like I said, the eyes are like cameras. Treasure what you have. Observe what you have and what's going on around you, and don't think that you are an insignificant person, whether you are rich or poor, degreed or not degreed. Don't think that you are an insignificant person. And as you said, Pam, we talk to the people who think that history began when they were born. And it's like, I did not know about the master plan. Well, okay, I'll put it like this. I grew up in a segregated era. And I started to see things change, I'm so glad to say. But the very fact that we lived over on Greenwood Avenue in East Austin, it was for a reason. Yeah, it was economical, but also because it was racial that we lived over on the East Side. There were more Blacks and Mexicans on the East Side, and I didn't understand that, except to be told, well, that's just where we live. Well, it wasn't until I read Austin American Statesman, a 100-year retrospective in 1971, which had articles around the 1928 master plan. And I had no idea that a Negro district was proposed to be created by City Council in 1928. And then it started to hit me. Well, that's why we are living in a certain area of the city. And I was 16 years old in 71 when I found that out.
Yeah.
And let me,
And only later did I find out about that there were Black communities in other parts of the city as well, prior to the 1928 master plan. And that I didn't know that until I was a grown man. I mean, I knew about Clarksville. I knew about that from the age of 19, but to know about these other communities, it was interesting to note that there was an AME church in South Austin called St. Annie's, and I didn't really understand that. And then my father may have told me something about that he had relatives who once lived in that area. So St. Annie still exists, but there are very few Blacks who now live in that particular area. That was part of a freedman's community at one time. So also brings up the fact that gentrification is not new. It's been going on. Gentrification in Austin, especially where Black people are concerned, is not something that just occurred within the last 20 years.
Yeah, and really
The 1928
because
master plan was gentrification.
because this is a cycle that's continuing, this this task, this call that we have, that everyone's talked about, to preach, to teach, but also to act. And for me, part of that activity, part of that process, is taking the ownership, but also understanding that we as historians, whether we're professional historians or everyday historians of our family or communities, we have value. There's importance, and the key word for that, on a professional level, what I do is significance, because something has to have a certain amount of significance to be considered historically important, to become a landmark, to become listed to the National Register of Historic Places. And it's being able to preach and teach that history and create that context. And so not only do we know and understand the significance, but that we can in essence, validate, even though it's important to us and we know the importance, be able to say, hey, this building is important because this story, this individual is important because. And so to retake ownership of the value of our history and the built environment that is part of that history is really important and really crucial moving forward in order to combat things like gentrification, and the preservation of East Austin or whatever community it is in which we're living. And it's not just for the Black community, but for other marginalized communities in neighborhoods in Austin, in Texas, across the country. So it's really important that, whatever these stories that we have, whether in the photographs, the funeral programs, and these things are really important. And they're increasingly important because we might have larger bodies of archives where our histories are hidden or much more difficult to get at. But a lot of the history that I've been able to gather and piece together come exactly from documents like this, to be able to tie together individuals into families, to tell larger stories and histories. And it's amazing how you can take, those very simple documents, pieces of information that might not seem to be important or have value, and to be able to utilize them to create a story, a thread that is really important or significant, as the case may be.
Absolutely. And, just listening to you all and thinking about, and I think, Rachel, you said it so eloquently, like this memory work, and, it's so important in so many ways. I mean, a lot of this work that's being done is, helping folks think through this idea around the right to return. Like they're using these archives and this history for other people. They're using, this information to get historical markers for their homes, so that they will, have a chance in staying and have their taxes lowered and all these things, in their homes for the folks that want to, stay. And so there's all these ways in which, the storytelling, this memory work is really is activism, right? And it's a fight for social justice. And, just me thinking about like from a more kind of spiritual perspective, and even one around just feeling loved and held, being in spaces, growing up in Austin and being the only little brown face anywhere, like for example, at Symphony Square. And, but always feeling this connection to the land, where I was sitting, the ground, the earth. And I always wondered about that. And then later, decades later, finding out that this home I'm looking at was, somebody a Black family who, had done all these amazing things in Austin. And, Red River was a Black area. Like all of these places that I would go and been made to feel like I shouldn't be there, but those were our spaces. And even though there was this way in which I knew that, just think about how even more empowered folks would be, right? If we went with that information. So it's just so much that has been, lost, and some of it intentionally. And, so this work of just bringing all this back together. So, my question around that for you all is, what do you feel people's responsibility are? Like what advice or what would you tell people, not only the ones that are new into coming into these communities, but people who are from here, who may not know this information, like how to begin to learn and collect this information and do their own kind of, search and exploration.
Well, that's a big question, Stephanie. What is wrong? You're just asking these huge, that's an hour answer. But what I would say is, I think there has to be some personal responsibility and accountability as community members to be, to practice always saying to yourself, like, where am I sitting? What community am I? Like, we don't do that. Like in this household, we're always training our kids to say where, to think about like, where are you sitting? And we have had a really interesting dynamic in this city where the people that are there now think there's an ownership component that comes with it, right? So I talk about when I'm over in the Leesville area, right? And I walk into the local club, they're like, good morning, welcome. And I'm like, no, welcome to you, actually. Because right, like welcome to you, not the other way. And just there's that kind of cavalier, we inhabited it now, so it's ours, versus this was something before, and there's an accountability as citizens, all of us, to know what that is and then bring that into the space. And there's so many ways that you can do that in a way that strengthens it and doesn't take away from it. So I think part of it is like practicing our way through, like, what was this before? It had to be somewhere before, because there's nowhere all the Black people fit in the 6 miles. Where else were they? Right? And so I think there's that opportunity. We just don't do it. We don't slow down to do it. If we practice it, it would be a natural part of who we are and honoring that. We just don't slow down to do it. So we talk about that a lot in our household, about, like, before you sit down, what was that before? What was that before?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Pam, I really appreciated something you mentioned earlier about building a culture of curiosity. And I think that that has a lot to, that is really relevant in this conversation right now, that people have, it seems like people have to be stimulated to be curious in order to want to know, which, I mean, is an approach. It's not one that I would take, right? You come into a space, like you said, you want to look around and understand before you take up space. But since that seems to be the society that we're in, I feel like there have been some good examples of it being done well through, I think, a lot of public art. Stephanie, I know you've been involved with that, with local parks, thinking about their spaces and historic sites, reevaluating what they're doing to create spaces and moments within those kind of micro environments for people to pique curiosity and get people questioning, and then point to more resources. So I think continuing that work, but I do, just echoing what's been said, I do think this is something that it begins where we are. Each of us has a responsibility, not only for the spaces that we occupy, but as we are in community with each other, kind of collectively, where we are and what we're doing and who's doing it, who's documenting that, how will it live on, how will we tell this story? Because like I said, if we don't shape the narrative, if we don't tell our story and protect our story as we want it to, then when it's out in other hands, we just don't know what will happen. So no one loves us like us. We need to always remember.
Amen. That's very true. I think everyone just really hit the nail on the head as far as, taking the ownership and being curious about, where we are in a place and time, what's come before. And for me, this is even thinking about, wanting to know more about indigenous peoples. I mean, because Austin and nowhere just, sprang out of the ground. Who were the people that inhabited those spaces and contributed to the built environment, changed and altered those environments for better or worse. And unfortunately for the Black community, for the Mexican community here, it's been for worse. But how do we recapture those stories and really reinsert ourselves into the narrative, right? Because history belongs to the victors. And rarely have we been, the victors. But it's reshifting that narrative and that focus then to think about the history of why these things have happened, and to, as I said, just reinsert ourselves in the narrative and take control of that narrative to then take control of future preservation work, future memory work, as the case may be, is really important.
Very true. Want to add anything, Harrison?
Well, this is where, basically we're all saying, we should become citizen historians, and, starting not just with each other, which all of us are, but also our family members, our relatives, those funeral programs, for instance. Save those programs that might seem insignificant to a lot of people, but no, that funeral program gives you a history, a biography of a person, what that person did, what that person believed, where that person lived. If nothing else, the dates that that person was born, the dates that person died. This is all history, individual. So we need to start by documenting, even just keeping a funeral program. That's part of your history. I have the diploma. Thank goodness that was kept by my grandmother, but the diploma that was awarded to my father when he was about 7 years old, or he was a little bit old. No, 1931, about 9 years old, because of good conduct, good penmanship, and he was awarded a diploma, and that was like 1931. And fortunately, that was saved, and just among so many other photos, of course, things like that. So all of us are historians. All of us are should take these possessions that we have very seriously.
History doesn't have to be, the grand thing. It can be those everyday moments create a history. They tell our story. And you never know what it is that you're going to find in those documents. And, with something like a good conduct or good penmanship document from school, that also tells the story of that school, that institution, and at that time, institutions and places of learning that are no longer here. And so we have a documentation of those stories, of that narrative as well. And so thinking about not only how within the individual or within the family, the stories that can be told or, to which they can contribute, but, that broader, larger narrative, that bigger historic context.
Absolutely. This has been wonderful. So I have one last question, and I'm going to try not to make it so big because I think this one has the potential going many ways. But this is especially for our community-based learning folks. And it is around how can local universities, so University of Texas, Houston-Tillotson, St. Edwards, all the different universities, ACC and colleges, use service learning to support like these grassroots preservation efforts.
I guess they need to be made aware of it, for one thing.
I do think also that I am who I am. The archive can't be left out of the equation. As has been said already in this conversation, history didn't start today when we opened our eyes, right? So even when work is focused on a particular time period, on a particular issue, on a particular community, taking the opportunity to engage with what's left from that time at our local repositories and libraries. There are such rich collections here in Austin. Such important work has been done already by colleagues of mine, present and past, to recover that work thoughtfully and carefully. And so I would just always encourage people to really place themselves in that history by engaging with what we know already as we continue the work. I mean, it's the grassroots work for preservation is what really makes a difference. So do it first of all, but then also engage with the archive.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I mean, just, coming from the university perspective, having my students actually literally this morning in my African-American experiences in architecture class, it was our final day and I had students doing presentations on the research that they conducted over the semester. The required component of doing primary source research in archives was done. And just learning from them based on the work that we've done, from conducting oral histories, for example. I had a group working on the Alexander family farm and speaking with descendants of that family, doing research on properties that were listed in the Green Book in Houston, for example, learning more about builders in Austin, primarily in the late 19th century, but moving into the 20th century, but also being forward thinking of not just doing the research and being one and done with it. How can we use that research and that activity as a form of social justice? Is it a website that will help the Alexander family continue to maintain their property and fight against, continued attempts at eminent domain for that property? Creating a database of sorts, something not unlike with Dr. Roberts, who is an alumnus of the School of Architecture, which he's done with the Freedom Colonies Project, but creating, repositories for this kind of research, whether we're talking about Black builders in specific. And I think right now is a really good time for historians, for academics to work with their students and pursue these kinds of activities because the students are thirsty. But if we don't provide them with those opportunities to do this kind of research and to be very open about it, be very transparent, about that research, then it's not going to be done. And I think, it's a missed opportunity. So just to take advantage of those opportunities, and not just at the higher learning level, but what kind of programming, although, of course, there are powers that be in various entities that would be opposed to this kind of thing. But, from the in the K through 12 level, what kinds of programming, teaching, field trips, aside from the norms, can we offer students that then, stay within their mind, stay in their experience, and that will contribute to the kind of work that they might do in their community, starting to ask family members about family history. Well, what's this building that used to be here? Or I learned this in school, or I heard this kind of thing, and being able to carry that with them through their experiences through school and beyond is really important as well. And so for my part, and really looking for and seeking these kinds of community relationships, and to know really what is it, what kind of projects or research that is needed in the community, what kind of public programming or things that students can create that will assist communities in preserving their structures, telling their stories, and so on and so forth. Take advantage of that, definitely. But also, I think it's important for all of us to figure out then how to use these things and how to put them together, because there are lots of different institutions, organizations, and whatnot who are doing the memory work. But how can we collectively make that available and accessible? Accessibility, I think, is the key, not only for the community, but for society at large to learn about the culture. And I think that, a site like the Chase Building and the programming that the Center for Community Engagement will be really crucial, really important for really helping to foster these kinds of relationships.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything?
I was going to yield my time because, again, that was perfect. I will say that I'm like, I have nothing, but I will say this. We talked a lot about this on our team. In these situations where we're convening opportunity to learn in educational settings, whatever that might be, I'm talking about the whole from college on, there's a missed opportunity, I think, about when you are in the space of learning about our history, in the space about learning about what we need to preserve, to talk about that there are some transferable skills that go with that when you get in that space, right? So we don't always talk about what that does for critical thinking, or how storytelling, in my opinion, is a hard skill. It's not a soft skill, right? You can transfer that into a variety of ways, whether it's a job. So sometimes I think we miss an opportunity in the educational setting to talk about this transferable skill piece. Like, how we present it is one thing, but how we leverage what you can parlay in that experience, I think, is a missed opportunity. So I always encourage people to think about what you're going to tell them, but think about what they get out of you telling them, and then think about what skills then could be extracted in any setting by way of learning your history. So that's all I'll add. Otherwise, I really, everybody has it.
Yes.
I always love it.
No, thank you all so much for that, for this whole conversation. I'm really grateful. I'm full, and I'm sure that's going to be the same for many other folks. This work can be difficult and challenging, as you all know, and so this is having folks kind of encourage you and is really important. So thank you all so much. And I did want to mention that there is several projects that we're all in collaboration with in one way or the other that will begin to roll out. And please support and follow each of our guests' amazing work that they're doing. And Jeremy, I will bring you back.
So first, let me offer up my thanks to our panelists. Appreciate y'all. Good snaps and claps and thank yous for y'all. And then also to our moderator, Stephanie, thank you for kind of leading us and guiding us in the discussion today. Big thanks to you as well. And then behind the scenes, again, Jason, thank you for holding it down, keeping it going, bringing people on and off stage. We really appreciate your support in that. This conversation was really great, y'all, and I thank you for allowing me to be privy to the conversation. Oftentimes, we don't get to hear about these histories, and sometimes we regulate them to the past as if they don't live with us today in our architecture, in our oral histories, and the stories that we tell. But I hope from this we see that these lived experiences are always in process. We're always in a process of becoming and getting to know and learning about that which came before us and that which is shaping our current moment. So thank you all for that. And with that, we have more conversations to come in the future. So thank you all for joining us today.